It's better now. It used to be really bad. What I realized is it was really bad when I was younger because I don't know if you're very lucky. Why the artists are out with Leanna name. So Leanna, Joanna, Rhea, so people will say Leanna, which is
Okay, so we went live. Oops. As I said earlier, there's no way we could have done the timing of this as we did. It feels odd that we're had the symmetry to have tonight's and this weekend's lecture schedule on anti-Semitism and to have Dr. Waxman with us. But there's one bit of gratitude that I have, which is this is a weekend for us to start processing some of this and to talk about and to kind of take a step back from the onslaught of doom scrolling online and wondering which news organization do we listen to, so that we can kind of hear some facts about what's going on when it involves what's happening on college campuses with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, where the two overlap, and I'll let Dr. Waxman talk more about it. Before we begin, though, I do want to say two big thank yous. The first is to Mayor Brad Cohen from East Brunswick and Mayor Brian Waller from Piscataway. I sent out invitations to all the politicians in the area to come and visit and be a part of this so they can hear what we as Jews feel in terms of what's happening in the communities around us. And the two of them showed up, and I'm really grateful that you did. Another round of applause. I also want to make sure everybody knows, because we're about to talk about anti-Semitism, which is going to raise some of our anxiety in the room. Yesterday, I had a meeting with the New Jersey Director of Department of Homeland Security and the New Jersey Attorney General. U.S.-Israel relations, American Jewry's relationship with Israel, Jewish politics, and contemporary anti-Semitism. Again, not at all relevant to anything happening right now. Dr. Waxman is the author of numerous books, scholarly articles, and his books include Trouble in the Tribe, the American-Jewish Conflict over Israel, and recently the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what everyone needs to know. And I believe you're still working on a book on anti-Semitism, which is what piqued our interest last year. He has been published in numerous locations like the LA Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, Atlantic Monthly, Foreign Policy, and Forward, Haaretz. And over the course of the weekend, we'll be interviewed by a couple of news outlets while speaking to us as well. So he knows a thing or two about what's going on. Dr. Waxman has also been a visiting fellow at Oxford University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Bar Ilan University, Tel Aviv University, and the Middle East Technical University in Turkey. Do you ever sleep? He has also worked as a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I think this man knows a thing or two.
Week now. Been, giving interviews to the media, following everything minute by minute, worrying, trying to explain to students, trying to avoid eruptions happening on my campus. And it's therefore especially meaningful for me personally to be with all of you this Shabbat, because I think when Israel and when the Jewish people are in a moment of crisis, and we certainly are in such a moment, this is, I think, undeniably one of the most difficult periods in Israel's 75-year history. It is very good for us to be together, to come together, to worry together, to talk, just to come together. So personally, I'm very grateful. I was grateful anyway to come, to spend, because I came last year and I enjoyed my visit very much, but particularly at this moment. So thank you for bringing me, thank you for having me, thank you for listening to me. So I'm going to change, I made a slight change to my scheduled lectures because I pressed you enough. But now I'm also going to talk to you about terrorism and war. So you're going to be even more depressed. Unfortunately, generally, when I am invited to give talks, people don't generally leave in a very happy mood, but hopefully at least you'll feel that you're reasonably informed. So what I want to do this evening specifically is not my prepared lecture on anti-Semitism. I hope you'll forgive me for that. I will give that tomorrow. But instead address the crisis that Israel is facing at this moment, address the terrorist attack that took place, the war that is happening as I speak, because I think the significance of that, I'm sure to all of you, is clear. And I want to spend some time talking a little bit about that and to try to provide maybe some background, some understanding, and also answer any questions that you may have. So what I'm going to do is kind of try to go through the attack that took place nearly 2 weeks ago, and then talk about that, and then a bit about Israel's response and the challenges that the IDF may face in Gaza and some of the international dimensions. So I'm going to try and cover all of that in about 30 minutes. And then, as I said, I'm happy to answer questions, and then I will spend the rest of the weekend talking to you about anti-Semitism. So you have that still to look forward to. Okay, so I think it's very, very clear for all of us gathered here this evening that this is a deeply painful, deeply worrying, sorrowful time for anyone who cares about the safety of the state of Israel and the Israeli people, and for anyone who yearns for Israeli-Palestinian peace. The death toll from Hamas's terrorist attack, as we know now, has now exceeded 1,400 Israelis, with 4,000 wounded, approximately 203 people are held captive as hostages by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip. And now, 14 days into the war between Israel and Hamas, around 4,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been killed and 14,000 wounded and over 1 million internally displaced within Gaza. Those are just the war numbers. Make no mistake about it, we are living through very dark days. Very dark days. Perhaps the worst period in the long history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since at least the Second Intifada. Israel, they captured 22 Israeli civilian communities in southern Israel, massacring civilians, seizing hostages, as the Israeli military appeared helpless. As we know, the militants entered homes, shooting women, children, and elderly at close range, and engaging in some truly barbaric and horrific atrocities. Many others who were taken, including young children, apparently there are some 20 children held as captives in the Gaza Strip, were abducted and taken to Israel. And at the same time, during this attack, Hamas fired approximately 5,000 rockets deep into Israel, which was a kind of high school. But on top of that, compounding that sense of vulnerability and fear is also a sense of humiliation that the country's vaunted security services, that the IDF was helpless. That Israelis waited hours, even 24 hours, before help came, and sometimes, in many cases, it came too late. So that compounds the sense of and that they are committed ultimately to the eradication, the destruction of the state of Israel. Ultimately, they aspire to establish a Palestinian Zionist state in the entirety of historic Palestine, the territory that they regard as rightfully theirs, and not just Palestinian, but Muslim as well. They are an Islamist nationalist. The right one fuses Palestinian nationalism on the one hand and Islamism. So I wasn't surprised in the sense that they had this goal, but I was surprised at the nature and the scale of this violence. Because when you look at Hamas violence over the years, since its military wing was formed in 1991, the organization itself came into being at the beginning of the First Intifada. In 1988, its founding charter was declared, but its military, it has both a political wing, political party, and a military wing, and it's the military wing obviously that carried out this attack, maybe without even the knowledge of the political wing. They tend to operate quite separately. But this military wing has consistently used terrorism because their approach is essentially to use violence strategically. So it's not enough just to say that this violence, this attack was the expression of kind of homicidal hatred or even genocidal hatred. There was a strategic purpose. There is a strategic purpose. However shocking it may be, however disturbing it may be, we have to understand what that purpose is. What did Hamas hope to achieve? So over the years, Hamas's use of violence has shifted. In the 1990s, they were called during the Oslo peace process in particular, Hamas really used the tactic of suicide bomb, right? Strapping explosives, explosive vests onto people, sending them into Israeli cities, going onto buses, into cafes, and blowing themselves up, including many civilians in the process. And that was a very effective weapon of terror, very cheap to do. relatively easy to pull off because a suicide bomber is the ultimate smart bomb, right? They can just go around the checkpoint, they can find them, it's complicated. And so for many years, that was Hamas's preferred modus operandi. And then once Israel constructed a security barrier in the West Bank during the Second Intifada, then Hamas had to adapt, right? And so suicide bombings basically stopped, and instead Hamas started using rockets, initially very crude rockets, very short range mortars, which were only even got as far as the Israeli town of Sderot in southern Israel. But over time, they improved these rockets, they developed the range of them. So now most of Israel is within the range of Hamas's rockets, although they're not guided in the way that, say, the president's are. They're still but they reach long distances. And so for the last number of years, that was Hamas's modus operandi, along with trying to carry out raids into Israel, like the raid that they carried out in 2006, when they abducted Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, held him hostage. And so that's generally been how they've operated, through rocket attacks, small scale. I say all of this so we can see that this attack is totally unprecedented in terms of Hamas's tactics, in terms of Hamas's violence, in terms of its terrorism. It's unprecedented in terms of the numbers, the size of this attack, the scale of it. It's involving, over 1,000 fighters. That's well beyond anything they've ever done in any previous attack. The sophistication of the attack, that they use cyber warfare. They jammed, they started the attack using cyber attacks on Israeli military. They then proceeded methodically to take out Israel's ability to list the IDF's ability to list the border posts and army bases, and from there carry out the assault on Israeli civilian users. Very detailed. They spent more than 2 years, apparently more than 2 years, planning for this attack. They had detailed intelligence of the layout of the kibbutzim, where to go, how long it would take the response. This was a level of sophistication that was not that Hamas was not known for, and that the Israelis did not think Hamas had that capability. And of course, to plan for that, to prepare for that, all under the noses of the IDF, the military intelligence, without getting detected. So it was sophistication in that respect. A strange word to use, but in terms of the scale of this. And then, of course, the savagery of the attack, the kind of violence, the atrocities. So it wasn't just about killing people the way that Hamas has done in the past. It was deliberately graphic, horrific violence, and it was broadcast on social media. You put all of that together, and as I said, as somebody who has spent some time studying us, I was scratched. I couldn't make sense of it. This is a complete departure from their typical attacks in the past, and moreover, it would invite, it seemed to invite massive retaliation. In fact, it seems to be this such a massive attack with such rapid, horrific violence that it would ensure Israel's massive retaliation in return. Right? It would ensure that Israel would be planning to invade the Gaza Strip as it happens, and that Israel would be seeking to overthrow the organization. So I was wondering, I've been wondering for the last couple of weeks, why would they do this? Why would an organization conduct what seems to be a kind of suicidal attack? In other words, they are endangering their own existence. Why would they do that? And there's only two answers. There are only two explanations that I can think of. One, and I don't. This is the one I don't have to agree, but I want to present it because somehow thought this is possible, which is that they succeeded beyond their intentions, strange as it may sound. That they did not expect the border to be so lightly guarded. They did not think that they'd be able to capture so many civilian communities, right? So that they were planning to, yes, murder people and abduct hostages, but not on the scale that they can. So according to this explanation, this is, by the way, what Hamas's leaders say in the interviews that they've given since. They said they were actually surprised and they didn't think that it would go so well. So they just didn't understand. So that's one explanation. Now, I happen to think that's not self-serving. They might. The other explanation is not that they didn't intend, but that they did intend. And the information, that the evidence that's coming out is very few. And I'm talking to you, obviously, just 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, the attack took place. So we don't. There's a lot I don't. We have to be kind of humble about that. But what's the picture that seems to be emerging from the information that's been gathered from the Hamas militants who were captured or who's on documents found on their bodies is that this was a plan. It was a plan to be a bigger attack than any day carried out in the past. The plan was to kill as many people as possible and to capture as many people as possible. That's why they spent more than 2 years planning it, right? That's why they devoted so many resources to it. And actually, for the past 2 years, while they're planning this, they very smartly engaged in deception. They concealed their intentions, just as Egypt and Syria, for example, did prior to the Yom Kippur War. They managed to also conceal their intentions. So, in other words, I suspect that indeed this was what they happened, and that begs the question then why? If this was deliberate, why? Unfortunately, the only answer I can come up with is that this is what they want. They want Israel to invade. They want to draw Israel deliberately. They want to provoke such a massive response that it will draw Israel into Gaza, from where they believe, presumably, that they will not lose, that they will actually be able to bring Israel into a kind of war of attrition, and will be able to defeat Israel, just as they believe that Hezbollah in 2006 in the Second Lebanon War was able to fight the IDF to a draw, which it was. When Israel entered southern Lebanon to fight Hezbollah in 2006, Hezbollah was very well prepared for that. The Israelis sustained high casualties and ultimately did not defeat Hezbollah, and Hezbollah's got any more power. So in a sense, that may be the model. That may be the plan. And I'm going to talk whether Hezbollah might be involved on this as well. So I think when we understand, when we think about this, it's not enough just to say Hamas hateful, homicidal, genocidal organization. We have to think, what is their strategy? And we have to consider what Israel's strategy should be in response, which is not to fall into or not to enter a trap that Hamas may have led. And that is my fear at this moment, is that is exactly what's happening. And there's a lot of danger, because Hamas spent 2 years or more preparing to carry out that terrorist attack. They also spent 2 years or more preparing for Israel's retaliation to it. And that means that they will be waiting, and we don't know what they have planned next. So I think it's not just a question, as some have said, that Hamas simply wanted to abduct Israelis. Yes, Hamas does want to abduct Israelis. They've been trying to do that, as I said, for a long time, for a very good reason. When Gilad Shalit was released in 2011, in exchange for 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. One soldier in exchange for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. One of those prisoners who was released is the current head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Sinwar. And he is on about, as far as he is concerned, to release his fellow prisoners. And so they do believe that certainly that was part of it, but I don't think that is sufficient, but it's certainly we want to understand the hostage dimension of this. That is essentially what Hamas will be seeking, not 1,000, because that's what we've got for one soldier, but they are demanding the release of all Palestinians. prisoners from Israeli prisoners. So it's going to be impossible to satisfy to arrange a kind of prisoner deal like the one Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to in 2011. Okay, I talked a bit about Hamas, and I'm going to explain my concern. I know it's depressing, but I think we have to face up to the dangers here. The danger is not just that Hamas are preparing for the IDF to invade Gaza, but also that Hezbollah and Iran as well. And we're already seeing today, particularly, but over the last few days, Hezbollah increasing, gradually escalating. Now, this may not be a prelude to Hezbollah getting fully involved. It might just be a way to draw the IDF to the northern border and to just divert resources to the northern border so that the IDF cannot focus solely on its war against Hamas. Or it could be a plan developed in coordination with Iran to stage a 2 or even 3 front war, which seems, incredible to imagine, but as I said, maybe you could have imagined 2 weeks ago what Hamas would have done. So right now we have to kind of stretch our imaginations, and I think unfortunately we do have to consider the possibility that it's a real serious risk that Hezbollah, that the situation will either deliberately be escalated by Hezbollah if and when the IDF invades Gaza, because they'll wait and then do it. Maybe once the IDF has once some of Israel's Iron Dome rockets have been depleted, so they can then use. And Hezbollah, as I mentioned, has approximately 100,000 precision fighting fighters, so which can be targeted everywhere in Israel. So it's on it's a much greater foe adversary militarily against Hamas, and of course it's also battle hardened from fighting in the Syrian civil war for the past decade. So if Hezbollah was to get involved, it would be. I still think Israel could win a 2-front war, but it would be much more serious than anything Israel has fought for since at least 1973, and that was a very serious and very deadly war for Israel. There's also danger. I told you I was going to depress you, but I think we have to see the situation for what it is and recognize the dangers. And there is also a danger of a 3-front war. I'm not just talking about the West Bank, I will talk about that as well, but there's also reports of Iranian allied Shia militia groups operating in Syria and potentially also joining. And just today, the US Navy shot down incoming missiles, ballistic missiles from the Houthis in Yemen. So if you put this picture together, this is not just random, unconnected developments. It starts to look like there's a plan. It starts to look like maybe this was the plan that Iran and its so-called axis of resistance have been planning for the last couple of years, which was to start with a Hamas attack, right? Always sufficiently massive, devastating, deadly, and gruesome nature that Israel would be bound to be provoked, right? Because it would not be able to not attack it in a massive way, to draw Israel into a ground war in Gaza, and then stage 2 will be then to open up a multi-front war. So in other words, it's possible that Hamas is shifting from this long war of attrition that it's been fighting for some time now, since 1921, to a much more ambitious attempt to actually defeat Israel. And I think what explains or potentially explains that shift is the perception that, in terms of the timing, the perception that Israel is a historically weak moment in its history. The domestic divisions and turmoil over the last over the past year that were generated by the Netanyahu government's judicial overhaul, right? Hamas, many of Yahya Sinwar and others, Mohammed Dev, who's the military commander, they're fluent in Hebrew, they watch Israeli television, they hear that Israeli reservists are refusing to serve and protest over the judicial overhaul. They hear that the IDF commanders and chiefs of staff warn the Netanyahu government that the divisions and the opposition to the judicial overhaul is actually affecting the readiness of the IDF, it's affecting military readiness. They could see how deeply divided Israelis were over this judicial overhaul, and they perceived Israel to be weak and to be vulnerable at that area, and that I think explains the time of the attack. Some people might tell you, oh, it's related to Saudi normalization. Bear in mind, this attack was planned for 2 years. So the prospect of the attempt by the Biden administration to broker a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia has not been going on for 2 years. That's what we the last few months. So yes, maybe the actual specific time, right, as in this, but I think it's a much longer plan, and I think it points to a much broader and more aggressive and ambitious attempt to actually defeat Israel through a multi-front war. Okay, so that's Hamas, and I think we need to be clear about the nature of the enemy. And it's easy just to say they're a terrorist organization and they're full of hate, yes, but they have a plan. And so far, they've executed that plan very well. So we should never underestimate a group like Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran for that matter. Okay, now let me just say a little bit about how Hamas is able to carry out this. And I've been emphasizing Hamas's capabilities because I think in many ways Hamas was able to carry out this attack successfully because we've been underestimating Hamas's capabilities. We've been underestimating them. We experts, and including myself, who thought that Hamas wasn't just the Israeli military establishment, it was pretty much every expert who thought that Hamas had been largely contained, right? That Hamas had become a governing party in the Gaza Strip, and that was basically what they wanted to do, was like govern Gaza. And as long as they felt that they were able to govern Gaza, that they would avoid making a major attack. And clearly we were wrong, right? We really underestimated Hamas's willingness, desire to actually defeat and destroy Israel. We thought that maybe they'd settled in some mini state in Gaza. No, they're not. And so we shouldn't underestimate. So I think part of why Hamas was able to do this was because of that strategic failure, which is first and foremost on the Israeli intelligence establishment, but more broadly, for one of us who didn't really quite recognize that Hamas, what Hamas's ambitions were, and that Hamas was not simply going to, stay boxed in, stay contained in the Gaza Strip. So there's a strategic failure in that respect. And I think the term that was used before the 1973 was the conception of the Israeli establishment was that Hamas could be contained and deterred. That's been completely shattered, that view. And now that's why now the focus is shifted to actually defeating and destroying, because there's an understanding that Hamas was not contained or deterred. But it's not just a strategic failure, it's also been an intelligence failure. There was no warning. There was no how, with all of Israel's technological sophistication and with the extensive network of collaborators and informers that Israel has cultivated over many years inside the Gaza Strip, how is it possible that they didn't know? The truth is that Hamas was planning this attack. Again, underestimated the enemy. Hamas were actually carrying out open public training. They could see them doing this, but they didn't believe they were doing it as a plan to attack. So again, I think there's a part of that, part of the failure of intelligence is underestimating Hamas. Also, some more, mundane explanation that Hamas simply stopped using cell phones. They stopped using technology, just as Al-Qaeda did, right? They resorted to much more old-fashioned low-tech approach, and that therefore obviates Israel's technological advantage. But it wasn't just the failure to detect Hamas's 2 years of planning. It was also the failure to respond to warnings. Just a few days before the attack took place, Egyptian intelligence warned, as we now know, this has been confirmed, that Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu personally received a warning from the Egyptian intelligence that Hamas was planning a major attack. They didn't act upon it. So there is a serious intelligence failure, a serious underestimation of what Hamas was seeking to do, and in many ways, an intelligence failure that's even worse than 1973, the Yom Kippur War. And to be fair, the head of the Shin Bet, who's responsible for the domestic security services, who's responsible for Gaza, for monitoring, has already apologized and said they would resign after the war, and the head of military intelligence. So they are taking some responsibility. Similarly, it wasn't just the intelligence establishment. The idea, of course, as we know, how was it possible that 1,500 Hamas fighters were able to kind of drive in trucks over the border? And we've heard that was border fence that had been constructed cost nearly $1 billion, and underground wall as well to prevent tunneling, and it was easily circumvented. And then, of course, there was a handoff. It's over. Low-tech ways of getting around high-tech kind of solutions. So part of that failure stems from the over-reliance of technology, right? The belief that with all of those sensors and with all of that high-tech equipment, that would somehow prevent these very basic low-tech ways of simply just using a paraglider or bulldozing over the place. But it's not just an over-reliance on technology, it's also the fact that there were far too few forces, IDF units, deployed to prevent the southern communities, the peripheral communities, because many of them were deployed in the West Bank. That's where most of the IDF had been deployed. Now there's debate as to whether they were deployed there to protect settlers from who were celebrating Sukkot. They were also there because, of course, there's been an uptick in violence in the West Bank over the past year. But the fact is that the IDF was largely and has been for a long time concentrated primarily in the West Bank. That also meant that the Gaza, the communities and the envelope, the Gaza were unprepared, weren't sufficiently defended. On top of that was the amount of time it took to respond. As I said, in some cases, 24 hours. The idea is too slow to respond, and in that crucial time, many Israelis lost their lives. So the Israeli chief of staff, the chief of staff of the Israeli of the IDF, has also taken responsibility and said he will resign after the war. And I'm sure there will be a serious commission of inquiry. But it's not just a military failure and an intelligence failure and a strategic failure. It's also a political failure. And one person is responsible for that, and that is the Prime Minister, who has not taken responsibility and has not offered to resign. In fact, he's not even apologized or even held a press conference to Israelis. In fact, he hasn't held a press conference to Israelis since he's been in office this time. And I put the responsibility on Prime Minister Netanyahu because, first and foremost, because not simply because yes, the government pursued this very divisive judicial overhaul, and that is what, as I said, created the conditions that led to Hamas believing that Israel was weak. Maybe he doesn't deserve to be blamed for that, though we can debate that. But he bears responsibility because it was his policy for the last 15 years or so, he's been in power on and off since 2009, mostly in power without the exception of the Democratic government. His policy was to bolster Hamas in the West, in the past, to actually strengthen Hamas at the expense of the more moderate. And you might think that's very, very strange. Why would he do that? Not because he supported Hamas, of course, but it served his ideological and political agenda, which is to prevent any peace talks with the Palestinians and to prevent the establishment of the Palestinian state. And essentially, by having Hamas in the Gaza Strip, this was Exhibit A, the best reason you could give for why there should not be a Palestinian state. Right? And so it helped in that sense make the case to Israelis and to the international community that there shouldn't be a Palestinian state because look, Hamas, they would be the ones in charge. It also demonstrated that there could be no negotiations with the Palestinians and dysfunction in the land. So by having that territorial split, which he sought to maintain and cultivate, it served the interest of avoiding any real negotiations and peace talks and served that ideological agenda. So I do think that Netanyahu bears a lot of responsibility for this. And I would just say, I think that view, my view, is held by most Israelis, and that when this war is over, there will be, I'm sure, a reckoning domestically. There will be, along with a condition of inquiry. And I think whatever Prime Minister Netanyahu has achieved for Israel, this will be the biggest stain on his political legacy, on his record, and he will go down as the leader who's responsible for Israel's worst tragedy, for its worst national disaster. And I think, I think that's right. I think we should go, if for no other reason than that, and our willingness to even accept responsibility. Okay, let me now talk a little bit about the war itself. Do I have some time? Okay. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Israel response and the challenges it faces going forward. Because as I said, this war is going to be unlike any of the previous wars between Israel and Hamas. We've kind of become tragically accustomed to periodic bouts of warfare between Israel and Hamas. Since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, there have been four kind of mini wars, right? 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021. The last land war was 2014, Operation Protective Edge. So there's been a number of these, and you might think, oh, we've seen this show before. This is not going to be like anything we've seen before. It's already clear. First, because Israel's goal, objective in this war is completely different than its previous war objectives. In the past, as I said, Israel's strategy of successive governments, starting with Olmert, and then through all the Netanyahu governments, Israel's strategy in the past through those wars was not to defeat Hamas, was to leave Hamas punished, bloodied, but in place, because there was the view that A, Israel doesn't want to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, and it doesn't want to rule Gaza, right? B, it's better to have Hamas than Hamaki, or ISIS, or Al Qaeda, or jihadist groups that might operate if there was complete chaos and no government. It's better to have the enemy, and C, as I said, from Netanyahu's point of view, and those of others on the Israeli right, it was good to have Hamas in power because that would make the case against any negotiation with the Palestinians and any Palestinian state. So for all of those reasons, previously Israel's military strategy against Hamas was to inflict a heavy blow, to punish it, degrade its military capabilities, kill some of its leaders, kill some of its fighters, and then call it a day and that was it, and then accept a ceasefire. And this was always done with the expectation that another war would be necessary at some point down the road, because sooner or later Hamas would recover and they start firing rockets again, and you have to repeat the cycle, rinse and repeat. This approach has a euphemistic term in Israel called mowing the grass. This was the term used for this strategy. Just like in Ghana, you can mow the lawn, you know it's going to go back, then you have to mow it again. So that is the approach of Hamas. You have to punish it, then it will then war ends, and then you have to do it again every 2 years, 3 years. And that was a track that caused great destruction, obviously, for the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians in Gaza. But the war we're witnessing now is not a repeat of those previous weapons designs, because this time, as I said, Israel's goal is fundamentally different. It's not to leave Hamas in place, it is to remove Hamas's government and to defeat it as a military organization. Which is to say, the goal is to prevent it from ever having the possibility, now or any time in the future, of being able to carry out attacks against Israel. That is a much more ambitious military objective, right? And that means that the war to achieve that is going to be much bigger, much longer, and much more destructive than any of those previous encounters. And I think, I can contemplate this. So we're just now 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks in, 14 days into this. What we've seen so far is just stage one, which is the aerial campaign, primarily focused on the northern Gaza Strip, which is where Hamas is government in the Gaza Strip is concentrated, and where Hamas's military, much of its infrastructure, like many of its tunnels, are concentrated in Gaza City and in the northern Gaza Strip. So what's been happening so far has been a very punishing air campaign designed in part to degrade Hamas's military capabilities in advance of the ground operation, in advance of the Israeli army moving in, and this is the most controversial part of this campaign, to force Gazan civilians, there's about 2.3 million Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip, to force them south, to force them to leave the area. It's kind of forced evacuation. You might wonder, why would Israel do that? Because the last thing what they want to do once they do enter the area, which I think will happen in the next week, or who knows, it will happen, is to fight in a densely populated urban environment where there are hundreds of thousands of civilians. The challenges of that are enormous. Not only, first and foremost, to civilians, right? Because it would be very, very many civilian casualties fighting in that kind of urban warfare, but also to Israeli soldiers, because of course Hamas fighters don't wear uniforms, so there would be no way for them to be able to differentiate civilian from fighter, and therefore it poses enormous risks to Israeli soldiers. So the idea is to force as many civilians as you can, right, to leave the area, so that basically the people who remain, you can assume, or more reasonably, are hostile, and therefore, so that's the strategy. Now, as I said, it has come at an enormous price to civilians, to innocent civilians. They've been about 1,600,000 from northern Gaza who have had to leave so far, maybe 1 million who have been displaced. And what's compounding this is the fact that it's been very difficult, especially with electricity and fuel and food being cut off, to meet the needs of those internally displaced civilians. So what's happening at the moment is a massive humanitarian disaster, which is what the world is responding to increasingly. So much so that the terrorist attack that led to this war is kind of now increasingly being forgotten, and instead the world is responding, and many people are responding to the humanitarian disaster that is unfolded. But I wanted to explain that because I think we have to understand what the IDS strategy. We can talk about whether it's a good strategy, a moral strategy, but it's not trying to kill civilians, and it's not trying to necessarily drive them out of Gaza. Rather, the goal is to try to force them into the south through carrying out this air campaign. Okay. The next stage then, and then I will wrap up, the next stage will be the ground operation, and I think that's going to happen. I will actually thought it would already happened, partly it's delayed for various reasons, but it will, I think, happen, and there are huge challenges that the IDF will face in waging this. First, as I've already alluded to, Palestinian civilian casualties. You know, it is one of these, we've heard this many times, it's one of the densely populated areas in the world. Like it is, the Gaza Strip is very small and very crowded. So having a ground battle in that against where many civilians live, against an adversary that is embedded in the civilian population is a nightmare. Basically, much even harder than Grodny or Fallujah or other kinds, because it's so deeply, because it's such a small area, it's so densely packed. So that's going to be one challenge, and as I said, that's why I think what the IDF is trying to do is drive those civilians out of that area. The second big challenge is the hostages. They're there; they are being kept in this approximately 300 miles of underground tunnels. Israel calls it the metro, the Gaza metro, about 300 miles of underground tunnels, deep underground, some of which cannot be reached through airstrikes. That's where Hamas leaders live. Right, so we're talking about very elaborate systems, not just like some little tunnel that a few people have done. This is like an underground city. That's going to be where those hostages are kept. So it's how to reach them and how not to kill them while we're conducting these operations, because Hamas are going to use them as human shields, and at the same time employ psychological warfare, showing videos. So that's going to be very difficult for the soldiers. It's going to be very difficult for the pilots, knowing that there are civilians, including, as I said, 20 of so children who are kept as hostages. Then there's the difficulties itself of urban warfare and tunnel warfare. Very few armies, even in Israel, can deal with that kind of tunnel warfare, fighting in booby-trapped tunnels. On top of that, as I've mentioned, is the risk of Hezbollah entering the war. So if Israel uses too much force, that I think increases the likelihood that Hezbollah will be involved. So it's going to be very hard to fight without escalating this into a two-front or even three-front war. And that's why I think the Biden administration in America is very involved, not just in supporting Hezbollah, but actually in the operation, because they're very worried about this turning into a regional war, which would, of course, draw the US directly in as well. And then, of course, on top of all of those concerns, if there is the prospect that this will be a long campaign, a kind of where the Israeli forces could end up in a situation like American forces have in Afghanistan, who are basically in a quagmire, where there is no victory, right? Where they are, and what that might look like is we've already seen that in South history after Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 to destroy the PLO, which operated from southern Lebanon, and then ended up being bogged down for 18 years before Israel unilaterally withdrew. Israel didn't want to occupy southern, but it's hard to get in, it's harder to get out. And then even in the optimistic scenario that somehow Israel is able to defeat and topple this Hamas government, then there's the question of what next? What happens the day after? Who will replace Hamas? Israel doesn't want to, and it's not clear that the Palestinian Authority would want to, or have the ability to, even if it did. So there's a real question, and I think that's also something that the Biden administration have been trying to get more clarity on from the Israeli government, maybe push the Israeli government to think about the day after. President Biden's Oval Office speech is, I think, indicative of the concerns that the US has on this. I think, just to say a quick word about the Biden administration, their response has been excellent. But I think it's also that, strong support and solidarity, and that's been deeply moving. I think in many ways, President Biden's given the speech that Prime Minister Netanyahu should have. But it's not just an expression of goodwill, right? It's yes, there's deeply pro-Israel, deeply sympathetic, and it comes from the heart. But there's a lot of American interests as well. And I think they are very worried about what the Israeli government, especially with some of the more far-right members of the government, what they might do. And their concern is, so first and foremost, is to prevent this escalating into a regional war. And that would have terrible consequences for everyone. If Hezbollah gets involved, now I think hopefully, my hope is that the very resolute posture that the Biden administration, that the United States has taken so far, will be enough to deter Hezbollah. They've sent 2 nuclear-armed aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean and American troops. That's a strong signal. Hezbollah and hope that they're saying we will get involved, and everything that President Biden said. It's not just to soothe and please the needs of Israelis. It's so Hezbollah knows that if they escalate, the United States will get involved. So I think it's very important, and that deterrence message is essential. I also think it's been very important that the Biden administration, that Secretary of State Blinken and President Biden go into Israel, because they are hearing firsthand what are Israel's plans. Do they have an exit? How are they going to avoid this escalating into a true war? Are they making plans for that? And what about the humanitarian situation? And the humanitarian situation is that's not just a question of wanting to make sure that no innocent Palestinians die or starve to death because they can't get food, which is a real danger. But it's also about giving Israel the time to conduct its war. Because if Palestinian civilian casualties mount and there's a humanitarian catastrophe, it will not be possible. There will be too much opposition domestically and around the world for Israel to continue conducting its war with American support. And it needs that support. So minimizing civilian casualties, both a humanitarian and moral necessity, is also a strategic necessity in order to effectively conduct the war against Hamas over time and not be forced to end it prematurely. So I do think the Biden administration has so far taken a very strong and effective stance. Whether that will be enough to prevent escalation, we will see maybe over the next 36 hours. The one thing that has disturbed me, and I'm sure it's disturbed many of you, has been some of the American public reaction, not the administration, but some of the reaction, some quarters. And I don't think we should over-generalize, because sometimes you can get a distorted picture from social media and the media. But certainly there have been some on the left in the United States whose reaction has been abysmal and disgraceful. And it's been very hard to witness the celebration that took place in Times Square a couple of weeks ago, that was sponsored by the Democratic Socialists of America, or the statements issued by some student groups at Harvard and places, basically blaming Israel for the mass killing of Israeli civilians. So that's been a shocking measure. I don't think we should see that as characteristic of American public opinion as a whole, but certainly it does indicate that there are pockets on the college campuses or on the left or elsewhere that has reached a point where their understanding of Israel is essentially so grotesque and caricatured that they have no basic ability to recognize the moral atrocity of slaughtering innocent people. And I think they should be called out uncritically. Okay, I'll end there. I'm sorry if I just really got all about it. It is a depressing subject. I can't say my talks for the rest of the weekend will be particularly uplifting, but relatively speaking, they might be. Thank you.
I think that unless people have an objection,
People have an objection. I think we should kind of absorb some of what we had, what we learned today. I found this to be incredibly enlightening and, for lack of a better word, refreshing to be able to get an unfiltered news source, an unbiased news source. And somebody who spent a lot of time academically looking at what happened and occurred to give it to us in an unfiltered way. I think we need to absorb this. And the other lectures that you have over the weekend are going to touch on these topics again. And those questions will manifest then. So unless there are any objections, which I'm not hearing, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the matter of 2 days you're writing your lecture. And I can already tell this is going to be an incredibly powerful weekend. So I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow morning at 9:30. Right here, I'm going to call up Rabbi Lowenberg in a second to lead us in Berchat Mazon. When Berchat Mazon is over, I know the hour is a little late. Help us by clearing your tables. That way, Team Potato can get out here at a decent hour. And a big thank you again to Team Potato.
I want to invite you to pick up the beer cone game on your table. The pages in this thing may